Welcome to my talk on open source. It's just about the source, isn't it? Why am I talking about open source and what it's about? Software engineer at Elasticsearch, director at the Apache Software Foundation, co-founder of Apache Mahout. Hands up if you know the project. Keep your hand up, Apache Mahout, if you are using it. Okay, no one to talk to after my talk. I'm a co-founder of Berlin Buzzwords, so if you're into search, scalable systems, storage, NoSQL systems, streaming, and you need an excuse to talk to your employer to pay for your trip to Berlin in June, go there. Now I want to know you a little bit more. Usually I do meetups, so I take this microphone and hand it around. We've got like 30 minutes, I won't do this right now. I've got a few questions here. How many of you run their own open source systems, projects? Okay, pretty much half. How many have contributed? Everyone? Nearly everyone? Okay. How many of you wrote anything about open source? Press, blogs, pretty much everyone? Okay. Have you helped your users with an open source project? Nearly everyone? Family counts. How many of you are using open source as part of your day? How many of you are contributing to open source as part of your day job? 100% contribution during day job? 1/3? Roughly 1/3? Okay. Been using, I won't ask that. So why should I care what open source is about other than the source code? I have a history of converting my family to free software, and my husband has a history of converting me to free software as well. How many of you ran into the issue of installing whatever operating systems there is, returning back during Christmas to find the system in a totally out-of-date state? I'm very grateful to my husband who converted the image database of my mom to a new version, digging down into the table structure of the SQLite database underneath. If you're betting your business on open source as an external dependencies, you may still want to think about what open source is about and what these structures are about. Because someday you may need a tiny little change applied to it, or your project may decide to go closed source, or your project may start blocking changes. So at least you want to understand what's going on and how to make changes. If you yourself are running an open source project, you want to know how to grow the strengths of your community. Well, you want to know how to attract a diverse set of people, or at least some people who contribute and help you. Because at the end of the day, you probably won't be able to do everything on your own. You want to, at some point, probably know how to deal with developers and contributors, such they have the same idea as yourself, such that you can assimilate them, and so that you can coexist in a nice environment. Also, you want to protect your downstream users from legal threats, apparently. Now, before we go down, let's first take a step back and think about what kind of motivations there could be behind you wanting to build an open source community. One goal could be, I want to build a business around the software that breaks into an existing market by changing the economics. Based on this goal, you may make decisions differently than if you say your goal is to collaborate with others who have the same needs as yourself to just fix the problems that you have. There may be different license decisions involved, there may be different communities decisions involved. Another goal could simply be to build up your CV, your reputation, skill set, whatever. Okay. Two questions you probably want to answer early on. One of them is, how much control do you want to exercise yourself personally, as opposed to how robust should your project be. What do I mean with that? You can decide that you want to have a benevolent dictatorship for life. That means you've got total control, you dictate the project decision, your company may dictate the project decision, but at that point where you lose interest, your project is out there and nobody knows how to continue. There's no like continuous flow. The alternative is to go, one of the alternative is to build up a group of equal peers to seek consensus. This may end up being slower, but it may survive people leaving. Okay, so let's first dig into the three obvious topics that you have to think about. First topic is copyright. Second one is how do you deal with trademarks, because apparently your project's probably going to have a name. It's probably going to have a fancy logo. What kinds of issues are waiting for you there? Copyright. That's simple. There's a legal dev room over there where you can learn more about this. This is just a very brief overview taken or inspired by the FSF. There's essentially two ways you can go for copyleft. This is where you yourself state that you care about any and all of my downstream users to have the use, study, share, improve rights. You go for LGPL for anything that's, especially like for libraries, especially if there are similar libraries. You go for AGPL for hosted software. You go for GPL and essentially for everything else. Then, if all I want to do is to ensure that my very own project gives the use, study, share, improve freedoms, I could go for a non-copyleft open source. If it's small enough so I don't care. If it's libraries where I want to push standards forward, it pays to have a non-copyleft license so that everyone can use it. If there's projects with established economics out there, it may make sense to use a non-copyleft open source license, like the Apache software license or what have you. Second topics that you will have to think about is patent law. I'm sorry, there's dragons there. I won't go there right now. There's a legal dev room. Talk to the people over there. That's definitely not my my best topic. Trademarks. Why should you even care about trademarks? You want to, on the one side, you want to find a project name that isn't infringing. Imagine that 3 years down the road, your project is successful. Suddenly, some commercial entity, or even worse, another open source community comes up to you and tells you, your name is infringing, change it. You don't want that. So before you start, you want to do a name search. You want to probably do a logo search. On the other hand, if you do have an established project name, you don't want to wake up in the morning searching on eBay for your project name, and there is like printed CDs out there with people selling your software without your permission and without downstream users knowing what's on that CD, whether it's actually your software or something malicious. Some examples here. What you want to know, so you want to avoid this case where open source software is being sold without your knowledge and without your approval, but you also want to figure out what infringing use is. Like, this is a GNOME logo. This is a logo that once was used for a feed pedicure service. It was decided this is not infringing because it's clearly a different area of business, but those are the kinds of questions that you will be facing them. Next question that you will have to answer for yourself is whether you should register your project name as a trademark. You don't have to as long as you're actively using and protecting it, but having it registered adds a certain additional level above it. How do I deal with these infringements? What you have to do is to find where the project name is used, identify whether this usage is infringing, and then actively fight. Actively fight sounds like going to court. Usually it's just sending out a nice email asking that person, hey, this is my trademark. I believe you're doing something wrong here. Can you change that? And usually this already helps with fixing cases. So far for the easy topics. Let's talk about the slightly messier topics, which is the people aspects. How many of you still believe the lone brilliant hacker legend? One? That's true, it's a good legend. So essentially my belief is that great software evolves from not only from one bright mind alone, but from a community that works together. And usually ideas are born based on pre-existing ideas. There's a saying at Apache which goes community over code. I would like to translate that a project without people is a dead project. You can go to the ZeroMQ community, which essentially has the same mantra, which says, I believe, people before code. So what are the people aspects that we have to care about? First of all, there's this lovely software that we've written. Where do we find users for it? Users are ugly, right? Where do you find them? How do you turn them into actual users? And once converted, how do you retain them as your users? That ties into subjects that are typically called also something like marketing. How many developers love marketing? Cheapest marketing out there. Go to Twitter, talk about it. Get other people to talk about it. Search for mentions on about your project, get involved in these discussions. When involved in these discussions, ask people to publicly share that they are using your project. Why should you do that? I've been doing Mahout for a couple of years. Going on Twitter and just searching for the mention of Mahout was a great way of finding downstream users, finding good use cases, which I then could again use as an argument in favor of my project. When someone came up to me, who's using you, then you have this list of people who are using your project, and you can also talk about what people are doing with it. That's a totally different story than just talking about a feature set. It's different telling people that Adobe is using Mahout as opposed to we've got a collaborative filtering algorithm. You go to conferences. If you're at ApacheCon, you go to. If you're at Apache, you go to ApacheCon. You go to FOSDEM. You go to FrostCon. Wherever you can find your community. You talk to the press. You can write press announcements. Those are like predefined texts that you hand out to reporters who then create nice articles from that. However, you may be surprised talking to the press. Oftentimes they are even happy to accept articles that you yourself have written with your name underneath. It does take time though. It does help to write books and have them printed. One warning, writing books is a huge time sink. Reviewing books as well. Some people may be more happy finding out how things work from the documentation than others. So you may need to talk about what you're doing and answer questions, which essentially means giving trainings. This can be done at conferences, it can be done during the hallway track, it can be done at a booth. If we are talking Apache, you can go over to the K buildings, there's an Apache booth there, you can figure out what the foundation's doing to you. And those kinds of hallway conversations give you much, like a little glimpse of what people are doing with your stuff. Next thing, giving support. Why should you give support? You want to help beginners getting started. We've had this nice talk just now on onboarding new people. There's one thing that I keep repeating to people who are afraid to ask questions. There are no dumb questions, only dumb answers. If your conversation is friendly to your contributors from day one, that may mean that one day they turn into active committers and active promoters of your project, so that you have less work to do. And we all want that, right? Another good source for helping people go to where those people are. Don't expect them to come to your channels. I've put Stack Overflow here. I've had an experience with Twitter recently where someone had a question about an Apache board report on Twitter. This person was then invited to post on the project list, and the communication on the email list of the project itself was much more detailed and much less flamey, much less aggressive than it had been on Twitter, just for sharing more details, just for making it a longer argument. So how can you help your project? It doesn't mean only contributing code, apparently. At Mahout and also at Apache, we've made several people committers just because they made an effort to help the users grok the project. So there were a couple people who helped on Twitter, there were a couple people who helped on mailing lists, answer questions for a lot of time, and at some point we just made them a committer and gave out this badge. Whatever badge you have, you want to give this recognition to active contributors. Remember that not everyone speaks the same language, so you may think about translating documentation. OpenOffice does a great job there, so does LibreOffice. You may notice that not everyone's comfortable with using mailing lists and IRC. So you may think about using a different communication channel like WebFora over here, potentially with a backend to whatever communication medium suits you most. Once you get people on your communication channels, once you start the conversation, one of the most common questions that I get is, how do I get started? I had a long-term Apache person come up to me just recently asking me how to get started on Mahout, and I was like, you're here for 15 years. You should know how to get started. Apparently he did not. The second most common question that I get is, when will feature X be shipped? Typically, what people answer is, patches welcome. Typically, what this amounts to is that users believe that this is not a welcome feature. At least in the communities that I've been part of, this is a cry for help. If people tell you patches welcome, what they really often mean is, please do start contributing. Please do help us get this done. And this can start with tiny documentation patches and go up to more complex architectural coding contributions. It's typically not meant like, yeah, go ahead, write it, we will deny it. It's usually, I don't have the cycles right now to get to it. If you make those patches welcome a little bit more explicit, that may be even more helpful in attracting people. The Apache Software Foundation has a project called the Attic. Any project that doesn't have enough traction anymore, like not enough oversight anymore, is being moved to the Attic. Before these projects move to the Attic, there is an announcement on the mailing list that they are going to the Attic. You would be surprised how many projects didn't go to the Attic because of this one last email, because of this one last cry for help. I did the same with Mahout, not because of Attic pending, but because the project was essentially very quiet. I made it explicit that we needed documentation help, we needed communication help, we needed help with press and PR, etc. Suddenly people knew where to contribute. Before, we had students coming to us telling us, we've got this brand new machine learning algorithm, do you want it? And we were like, not really, not yet another one. What we need is something different. When we made explicit what this something different was, suddenly contributions were much more valuable. Same thing happens at other projects as well.
Sorry, question to that.
Yeah.
Is this a hard rule, like you say, if there's no commits within 1 year, it starts this edit process? Or
no. There's just one rule. Like at Apache, you have a so-called PMC, Project Management Committee. For each release, you need 3 PMC votes. If it's apparent that there's less than 3 PMC members active, then it's very clear that this project is on its best way to the Attic. So you need 3 people active watching the project, and the reasoning behind it, one reason behind it is, imagine there's a security issue coming in. The project doesn't need to be able to make a patch and make a release. If there's less than 3 people, by definition, they are unable to do that. So they are doing a disservice to their users. And when you are in the situation, you are more than welcome to add more PMC members, because this is what makes the community thrive. Another good way to talk about where can people help is to have real-time help requests in your issue trackers. How do you keep people motivated who submitted their first patch? Here's the patch, often scratching the developer's own itch. As soon as you see it, your clock starts ticking. Back when I was at my first job, I contributed to, I believe, rules, but I had a fixed amount of time given for this project. When this time was up, I had to scramble to get back and make any changes to it. So getting fast feedback is a way to get more and better patches and to get better refinements. Getting feedback after months also isn't a very good motivator to go back to this thing that you wrote months ago. You want to give feedback early. Apache Hadoop does a good job there, as they've automated most of the tedious stuff, like is there a test, does it apply, does it adhere to coding conventions, etc. Another thing is to merge quickly and to have clear rules for what constitutes an acceptable patch. Nothing is more frustrating than spending hours and days and weeks on a patch to get it right and correct, only to figure out that this is not what the community wanted. So you want to have clear rules for what is acceptable up front. You can ship chocolate to keep people motivated. For my first patch ever that went to the Tools project long before it was at Red Hat, the reviewer, despite sitting in Australia, gave me speedy responses and offered iTunes vouchers so that I would convince my manager to actually approve the submittal. I didn't want the iTunes vouchers. I was more into getting publicity for Apache Mouth back then, so I got a blog post. But what was much more motivating than this kind of feedback was the thank you that I got. I got a thank you on the issue tracker. I got a thank you in the commit message. I got a thank you in the next release notes. Those don't cost anything, but they help your downstream contributors tell their boss, hey, look, this actually generated some publicity on the wide internet for you, and you can point to it. So giving thank you consistently helps. Another thing that you want to think about long term, saying thanks only goes so far. If you have people who are contributing a lot out of their day job, sooner or later they're going to be frustrated. They may run into burnout. They may run into issues. So for long-term success, you want to figure out how to help these people. You want to find payment for these contributors. This can be done through sponsorships and donations, which are funneled through to your contributors. I've seen that happen. It can be done through finding work contracts for them. It can be done through finding freelance contracts. Yes, that's a whole new topic and talk. Also, speaking about money, sooner or later you will end up wearing multiple hats, so you want to make sure that you don't confuse them. We had a keynote over at Berlin Buzzwords of a person talking about an open source project. It was totally open source related, but the slide decks that he used had his company logo on it. It wasn't well received, and the speaker didn't know why it wasn't well received. I pointed him just to the master slide, and he was like, oh my gosh. Ever since he put up his company hat when he was talking company issues, he would come on stage with the company hat and explicitly put it down when it wasn't about his employer. And this kind of like helped set the environment. Speaking about funding, we already talked about funding for paying people. What else do you need money for? You may need money to pay for infrastructure. There's like hand-hosted hosting versus self-hosting. You may need time to configure your infrastructure. You need machines to actually work on, like your laptops. You probably also need machines to run continuous integration on. There are great services out there. Speaking from an Apache background, the goal there is to build open source projects that survive the next 50 years. SourceForge didn't survive 50 years. So you do want backup services for your interaction. Again, you want to get funding for your own time. Speaking of Apache, you can donate. Shameless plug. Speaking of communication, first and foremost, you want a clear mission statement so that people know what you want to do as opposed to what you do not want to do, so that you can point them back. You want to avoid having this kind of mass media where you have an exponential growth in connections. You want like a central place, like a central mailing list, a central point of truth. I'll quickly go through the means of communication. Face-to-face, meeting in person, like we do right now. It's high bandwidth, it's great for resolving conflicts, but it's definitely not durable. It has to be repeated over and over. Let's go one step further. We take video chat. It's still pretty high bandwidth. You see faces, you see interaction, but it's barely durable. Imagine having to re-watch every discussion video that was happening in the past when you joined in a project. That's not feasible. One step further, online group chat, lower bandwidth, it's text only, but at least you can search and you can skim through the logs, but it's still pretty unstructured. One step further, web forum. You can still search. Now it's asynchronous, so you don't have the need to be in the same time zone, and it's still lower bandwidth. Go one step further, mailing lists, pretty much the same as web forum, pretty durable, asynchronous, needs a decent client, and it has the disadvantage of being low bandwidth. Usually for longer term discussions, design discussions, really nice. One more thing, you can have an issue tracker. It's much more structured than the mailing list, because suddenly you have discussions structured by issue type, by component type, but it's lower bandwidth. However, it can be very fine-grained discussions. What else do you need? You need some kind of high-level overviews. That's something you can't do with the media we've seen just now. That's something where you want to do a wiki page, web page, stuff like that. So essentially, one thing that I find very important for projects is to have one canonical source for decisions. At Apache, there's a saying, what didn't happen on the mailing list didn't happen. If you have face-to-face communication and you don't take it back to the mailing list, it didn't happen, because not everyone saw it. Okay, what else? Mental health problems. There's the licked cookie effect. If you say you want to do something, actually do it, or give it explicitly back, otherwise it won't get done. There's great content on not taking on too much work. You will end up at some point growing older, going into physical issues. Read up on these issues, or it may be very painful. If you are successful, you will have to find a way to integrate people who want to drink from the fire hose, as well as people contributing to your project at the free time. That's something that the very successful open source Apache projects are dealing with a lot. You will have to figure out how to deal with poisonous people. Just two links. There's a nice talk by Colin Sussman and Brian Fitzpatrick. There's another great talk by Christian Köntop on YouTube, however in German, on how to deal with flame wars and breaking communication breakages. Last but not least, you will want to plan for your exit. I built up Berlin buzzwords in the year 2010, mostly through my private inbox. It took me 5 years to get this event out of my inbox, handed over to the event producer. I still have people coming up to me personally asking questions about the event, even though I officially stepped down. I'm not anymore on the program committee. I'm not anymore involved with the project. There's still people coming up to me. It took me 5 years to hand all the contact points over. It took me 5 years to hand over the strategy for finding speakers, finding keynote speakers, evaluating submissions, etc. Plan for that from day one to make your project sustainable and to survive your own disinterest. And with that, I'm open for questions. Yes?
When you talk about making it sustainable, would it help to prepare for each of those tasks somewhat of a protocol?
So the question is whether it would help to prepare a protocol for each of these tasks for handover. Yeah.
And then you have it for yourself as well, because you don't think.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes total sense. So ZeroMQ has the C4 protocol for contributions. Apache has something smaller, like the bylaws per project, where basics are being written down. This definitely helps. Yeah.
How would you decide which various support for are best to spread the project about? So you could have the mailing list of people answering web forums. How would you decide which web forum to use to have a presence for?
So how would I do? You mean which system I would use?
Yes. How would you judge which system to use?
Two decision criteria: what suits best my workflow, and what suits best my downstream users. Ask your users, talk to your users, and then figure out what works best for you. Yeah.
About the money, I agree with you that sooner or later you have to consider this, because you cannot stay just enthusiastic, you know that better than I do. Among the possible means to find channels, did you ever consider sponsored money?
Yeah.
From private companies, from government, from yes, and do you have some experience?
So for me personally, so the Apache Software Foundation does accept sponsorship. It's not on a per project basis, it's on a foundation basis. So what they have sponsored is stuff like infrastructure, stuff like people doing press, etc. I do know other projects where development work is sponsored as well. That's not CASF. I can't talk too much about it because I don't know exactly how this is set up. This is not my project. I believe it was somehow that these people were funneling this money through a foundation. I don't know how it was set up. But this also is like it's also possible to get funding for development work.
Okay, so was that foundation level, not specifically for our project?
For Apache, it's at the foundation level, but not project specific. There's other foundations who do it differently.
And what would the sponsor get in return?
Visibility.
That's amazing.
For Apache, it's visibility. At Apache, you don't get project influence, but because projects essentially are independent, you get visibility. Yeah.
Something I've noticed in the past couple of years on different projects has been a developing interest in collecting data from users, per se, usage information, and these things. What are the kind of best practices there? Privacy, who gets access, for what?
So at Apache, essentially everything is open, everything is transparent. It's the only thing so if you come to Apache and talk on the mailing list, so all of these emails are open. I believe there's only a very limited chance of getting emails that you send to these email lists retracted. Like if there's any privacy